International Holocaust Remembrance Day, observed annually on the 27th of January, marks the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest Nazi death camp, in 1945. This day is dedicated to honoring and remembering all victims of the Holocaust, a period marked by the labeling, persecution, and mass murder of 6 million Jews, alongside millions of others, under the brutal Nazi regime. While the Jewish community was the primary target of this genocide, known as the final solution, other groups also suffered under the Nazis. This year marks the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. At the same time, we are also experiencing record levels of anti Semitism all over the world. Telling the stories of Holocaust survivors is more important now than ever because history teaches us what can happen when anti Semitism is left unchecked. We owe it to people like Eva and Mickey Kor, who we will hear about shortly, to make sure that this time when we say never again, we keep our promise. In honor of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, we are talking to Dr. Alex Kor, the author of the book A Blessing, Not a Burden, and the son of two Holocaust survivors, Eva and Mickey Kor. Alex, thank you for agreeing to let us interview you today.
Thank you, Jordan, and thank you, Coby. I appreciate the opportunity.
Our first question is most people know about your mom, Eva. So, can you tell us a little bit about your father and his experiences?
Sure, great question, and really one of the reasons that Graham Honecker and I, my co-author, wrote the book. Particularly here in Indiana, most people do know my mom's story, but I found it very interesting, I guess is probably the best word, that many people that knew my dad for years and years and years never knew my dad's story. And my my mom passed away in 2019, and after that, I spent a lot of time with my dad, particularly the last year and a half of his life. And I told him, I said, most people don't know your story. And he said, well, Alex, nobody's going to really be interested in my story. I said, well, I think you're wrong. So I promised him I would write the book, which we published in May. So my father is from Riga, Latvia. I'll try to make this somewhat concise but informative. Riga, Latvia is one of the old Baltic states of the Soviet Union. My father was from a very traditional Jewish family. He was the youngest of four brothers. His father, ironically, was a shoe cobbler. I'm a foot doctor. I'm a podiatrist. And so life was pretty normal. He played soccer, enjoyed his brothers. And then things changed in 1941. And in the fall of 1941, his father, my grandfather, was on his way to work. And there were already restrictions. The Nazis had already occupied Latvia, and my grandfather was walking on the street, wearing very traditional Jewish garb, and they told him, "You're on the wrong side of the street. Jews can't walk on this side of the street." And my grandfather wasn't going to obey this rule, so he kept on walking, and they killed him immediately. And then in a short period of time, um, my dad's oldest brother, Zori, was on a Latvian ship. He was part of the Latvian Navy. He was in his 20s, and they found out he was Jewish, and unfortunately killed him and threw him overboard. So within a very short period of time, in the fall of 1941, my father lost his father and his oldest brother. And then the family was taken from their home to a ghetto. And as I tell kids your age, these ghettos were not what we think of like in big cities in the United States. This was where they put Jewish people here in Riga, barbed wire surrounding it. You could not come and go, minimal shelter, minimal food. And the family would, try to get by day. Uh, and so over a period of time, they decided at one point to evacuate, liquidate the ghetto, which meant code word for who would live and who would die. And so they basically took the group, and any elderly people, young children, women were put on one side of the ghetto, and younger men that could work, adult males that could work on the other side of the ghetto. And my father immediately went to the side with his mother. He was 14 or 15 years old, and his mother knew what was going to happen. And she said, Mickey, Michael, you need to go with your brothers. And my dad said to his mother, my grandmother said, look, my life won't be worthwhile if you're not here. I want to be with you. And she said no. And obviously she won the argument. So my dad then went with his two brothers. And shortly thereafter, on November the 30th, 1941, my grandmother was killed in the Rumble of Forest, which was near the ghetto. There was a massacre. And for a period of time, my dad was with his two brothers. The second oldest brother at one point was on a work detail, and the Nazis said, well, you carry this log to the end of the field, and when you come back, I'm going to kill you. And my uncle, when he came back, killed the Nazi and escaped, and eventually ended up in the Jewish homeland of future Israel. So now for the next 4 years, my father was with his brother Leo. They were in the ghetto, they were in Kaiserwald, which was a concentration camp, then Stutthof, and then eventually 1945 Buchenwald. And in April of 45, my father and my uncle Leo were on a death march, and they could sense that the Nazis were losing the war. The morale of the Nazis was bad. And my dad would say, you know, he didn't like the Nazis when they were winning the war. Sure as heck didn't like them when they were losing the war. And so at one point, my dad's thinking, well, they're just going to kill us. So they were going around a ravine, and there was a little break, a little area where it looked like he could make a run for it. And so he decides, now he's of course 19 years old now, he runs for it. They shoot after him. He runs and runs and runs, and he hides in a building. And the rumor was that the Americans were coming through this area to liberate. And so the next several hours, there's fierce fighting. He's just hoping he doesn't get killed, and he, you know, doesn't know where his brother Leo is, who was still on the line. And so then there's quiet for about 2 hours, and then he hears this weird language, and he knew it wasn't, my dad was very good with languages, and he knew it wasn't German, it wasn't Latvian, it wasn't Hebrew. He thought, well, maybe it's the Americans. So he comes up with his hands up, and there were 3 American GIs, and they could see he was a Holocaust survivor because his clothes had been torn. He had lice all over him. So they gave him a Coca-Cola, and one of the GIs said, how does it feel to be free? My dad knew the word free, and he said, good. So these 2 or 3 GIs from this battalion kind of hid my dad for a couple of days from their commanding officer. Their commanding officer was Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Neff from Terre Haute, Indiana. The thought was that Mr. Neff would think that my father was more of a liability and that he might not be able to stay with the battalion. Well, a couple of days later, Mr. Neff, Lieutenant Colonel Neff, met my father, and could sense that my dad knew the area, knew the various dialects, could help the battalion build bridges, which was their main reason for being there. And so they gave my dad GI clothes. He was with Mr. Neff for about 3 or 4 weeks. One interesting thing, which I think both of you probably know, the day my dad was liberated, when he got the Coca-Cola, was April 15th, 1945. Years later, my birthday is April 15th. So my father was with the battalion, 250th Battalion, for about 3 or 4 weeks. Now they're into May. They do get to a dangerous area. My dad didn't know how to fight, use a gun, so they had no choice but to put him in a refugee camp. And my dad looked at Mr. Neff and said, I want to go where you're from, meaning this place called Terre Haute, Indiana. And so my dad, when he was in the refugee camp, the war's now finishing up, he starts writing letters. One of the letters ends up on the doorstep of Mrs. Neff in Terre Haute. She telegrams her husband, who I believe now is in Great Britain, got to help that little boy. Mr. Neff then contacts the soldiers who were still in the area and said, you got to find him in the refugee camp. And so for the next year almost, my dad was with the battalion, and that's how I learned how to read, write, and speak English. Mr. Neff now was back in Indiana, trying to figure out a way to get my dad into the school corporation in Terre Haute, because My dad's 4 years of high school were actually 4 years of concentration camp. So on May 11th, 1946, my dad boarded a boat, the SS Marine Flasher, and that took him from Germany to New York and then a train to Terre Haute. So that's a 4 or 5 minute response to your question, Coby. But I think my dad's story is very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
both of you. Thank you. So, what was your father Mickey's life like before he was in the Holocaust? Like, did he go to school?
They went to very religious Jewish school. I have pictures of my father, like 10 years old. He was the entire family played soccer. Sports was a big deal. The other interesting thing is that my grandfather really emphasized understanding current events, reading newspapers. And so they were, my dad was very attached to his mother, perhaps somewhat of a mama's boy because he was the youngest of four boys, played soccer, went to Jewish school, was a big fan of the Riga Opera House where I went last summer. He would go there and listen to, he loved opera music. And so my dad liked, that's where a lot of his musical interest came from. And so, I think he lived a very traditional Jewish life, pre-war. And so obviously everything changed in the fall of 1941.
Thank you.
Your mom was a victim of the twin experiments by Mengele. What was that like? And did she experience any sickness from the Holocaust from after the war?
So, Coby, that's right. My mother is one of the Mengele twins. Maybe I need to give a little background on that. Dr. Joseph Mengele was a Nazi doctor. He was eventually assigned to be at Auschwitz, and one of his mentors, Professor von Verschuur, had an interest in studying twins. Um, and the idea was to perhaps ultimately to purify the German race. Eugenics was a term attached to von Verschuur, and so Mengele, once trained cattle cars came to Auschwitz, he would look for twins. Over a period of time, there were 3,000 twins experimented on, 1,500 sets of twins, boys and girls, ages 3 to 14, 3 to 13. In May of 44, my mom's twin, two older sisters, and parents were taken from their home, put in a ghetto, similar to my dad's experience, and then were put on a cattle car. 3.5 days later, the cattle car stopped, ended up slowing down, stopping. Cattle car doors open, mass chaos. Nobody announced, when you arrive on a plane or a train, when you guys go to New York, hey, we're here, Union Station or whatever, Penn Station. There was nothing like that. The cattle cars open, mass chaos. My mom's dad disappears in the crowd. The two older sisters disappear in the crowd. And so the next thing you know, they step down to the selection platform. My mom and my aunt holding on to their mother's arms, not knowing where this place was. They had no idea. Somebody was running up and down the selection platform, yelling twins, twins in German. And my mom and my aunt were 10 years old. They looked alike, they dressed alike. And so one of the Nazis yelled, "Are they twins?" And before my grandmother said yes, three Nazis jumped out of nowhere, removed my mom and my aunt from their mother. The last thing that my mom remembers is her mother's arms stretched out, screaming and crying, being dragged away. If my mom were here today, guys, she would say that the one regret she has always that she didn't know it was be the last time she saw her mom and that she didn't have a chance to say goodbye. The first night they were in a barracks. They were raised to be very good Jewish girls, raised kosher, and so there was food brought, and it was supposedly soup. It looked like mud, and my mom and my aunt said, "Well, we're not eating this because we're not going to eat until we see our parents. One of the older twins said, look at the distance, see the smoke there from the chimney? That's where your parents are. And my mom said, oh, that's crazy. And the older twins, well, you'll find out tomorrow. You'll meet Dr. Mengele. Mengele came in the next morning. All the twins stood at attention like little toy soldiers. And that's when my mom realized, she was part of medical experiments. They were never given a choice. When you and I go to the doctor and you get a flu shot, your parents sign a consent that says you understand, they understand that you're getting a flu shot to prevent the flu, but there are certain potential side effects. You can end up with a headache. You could end up with whatever. They were never given that opportunity to sign informed consent. They were part of the experiments. To this day, nobody really knows exactly the purpose of the experiments. Some people, the twins in particular, theorized that he was trying to find a fertility drug so they could perpetuate and multiply the German race. If one twin died during the experiments, the other twin was killed, and they did comparative autopsies. So my mom arrived, as I said, May of 44. And by December of 44, they could tell, like my dad could tell, that the Nazis were losing the war. And then, as both of you know the story, January 27th, 1945, which we're almost 80 years away from that date, the Red Army, the Ukrainian Army, the Soviets came to liberate. And there's an iconic picture with my mom and my aunt at the front of the line of all the Mengele twins. And within several weeks, they were then in a convent, an orphanage in Katowice, which is a nearby city. And the nuns ran the orphanage. The sheets were clean. The food was good. But my mom and my aunt desperately wanted affection. They missed their parents. So eventually, one of the other twins' mothers, the Chengara twins' mother, came, signed my mom and my aunt out, saying that she was related. My mom and my aunt eventually ended up getting back to their village, hoping against hope. Surely they survived. Surely their parents survived. With great disappointment, they entered the house. The only thing that was left was a family dog. My mom would tell you that the Nazis killed people but didn't kill dogs. A couple of weeks after that, they ended up with an aunt, their aunt in Cluj, Romania, a bigger city. And then eventually, in 1950, they went to Israel. Just to put the story together, my father came to visit Uncle Shlomo, the one that had killed a Nazi in 1959. Met my mom on a blind date. And a couple dates later, my dad asked my mom to marry him. My dad's English was good. My mom's English was bad. My dad's Hebrew was terrible. And so my dad asked my mom a question. She said yes. He pulled out a ring and they were engaged. And so to answer your question, many of the Mengele twins had health problems. And my mom was not unique to that. One of the things that happened the first several years, she had a lot of nightmares. When she washed herself with soap, there was a rumor in Europe that after the war, the soap was made from the flesh from victims of the Holocaust. And so nightmares were a problem. Many of the twins had liver and kidney problems. In 1987, my aunt in Israel was going into kidney failure. So my mom flew to Israel and donated one of her kidneys. When they took the kidney out of my aunt for the transplant, that kidney in my aunt had not developed beyond the age of 10, which would have been the time that the experiments were done. And, unfortunately, as we all get older, even though you guys are young, the more and more Holocaust survivors, unfortunately, are passing away every year. To my knowledge, there is only one set of Mengele twins still alive. That's the Chengara twins. Those are the twins that they're actually from the same area as my mom and my aunt, and they live in Israel, and their mother was a friend of my grandmother. But everybody, many of the Mengele twins died of natural causes, but there was a very high incidence of liver and kidney problems.
That's very interesting. So you just told us that both of your mother's parents passed away in the Holocaust. But what happened to your mother and fathers, what happened to their siblings, and what happened to your father's parents in the Holocaust?
A lot of questions, Jordan. So my mother's father, Alexander, who I'm named after, my mom heard years later that he was alive for maybe a couple days once they got to Auschwitz. If you touched the barbed wire, you would be electrocuted. My mom heard somebody tell her years later that he ran into the barbed wire and basically committed suicide. Um, my mom's mother, um, this is a good question, Jordan, because I've never been asked this. My mom's mother was very frail and sick as they were on the cattle car, and my mom theorized that probably she didn't last long at Auschwitz. The two older sisters were we actually at one point thought they were still alive years later, but they were taken from Auschwitz and put on a train maybe the next day, maybe a couple days later, to work in another camp. And the story my mom heard, and we don't think they were ever processed at Auschwitz. Processed meaning you got a tattoo. And so they were on a train bound for another camp, and we believe that train was bombed by the Allies, so they were killed in that explosion. Obviously, my aunt survived. My aunt and my mom went to Israel in 1950. My aunt married an Israeli native, also known as a Sabra. My aunt died in 1993 from cancer as a result of the experiments, more than likely, after my mom's kidney was transplanted, I should say. She started developing urinary tract polyps in 1991 and unfortunately died of urinary bladder cancer June 6, 1993. On my father's side of the family, Zori, we spoke of, died in 1941. Shlomo, the one that killed the Nazi, had a very long career in Israel as a newspaper executive. There is an Israeli newspaper called Mahariv. He was a high-ranking executive, and he died. He woke up. This is a very sad story. He and my father were very close, but my dad's Hebrew over the years got worse, and my uncle's English was minimal. So when I would go to Israel, I would always play a trick on my dad and Uncle Shlomo. I would tell Uncle Shlomo, I have somebody on the phone here that wants to speak to you. This is before cell phones. So I put my dad and my uncle on the phone. They didn't speak the same language. They would be on the phone for an hour talking, I think, in Latvian, or German. I have no idea, but you couldn't get them off the phone. And so I'd say it was about 2006 or 7. My uncle in Israel wakes up on some morning. He said, this weekend after Shabbat, I want to call Uncle Mickey. He tells his kids this. And they said, well, we'll do it Saturday night after we celebrate Shabbat. My dad never knew this story. On the morning that my uncle was going to call my dad, he woke up, had a heart attack, and died right away. Never spoke to my dad. Very sad. Leo, who was on the death march with my father, we still don't know where he was liberated from because he was on a death march leaving Buchenwald. We're still trying to figure out, and the records nowadays, you can find out almost anything. But Leo ended up coming to Hartford, Connecticut, working the lumber business, married another survivor. They have a son, my cousin, Robert. And Leo eventually wanted to move to Florida. So they moved to Florida, and very tragically, he did well there. One day on a highway, his car broke down, 1980. He was walking to go to a gas station, and the car hit him and killed him. So we had a very sad story to Leo's passing. And so my dad's father died in Riga. My dad's mother, Mirka, died in the Rumbula massacre. There is a movie coming out called Rumble as Echoes, done by a Chicago filmmaker that talks about the Latvian Jewry and what happened toward the end of 41 and throughout the war. I think I covered everybody.
Our next question is, how did the Holocaust affect your parents for like the rest of their lives?
How much time do we have here, Coby, on the Zoom? That's a great question. There's a lot of ways I can answer that. Obviously I didn't know my parents, before I was born, but my mom would say that my dad's personality changed a lot once he got into Indiana. I was born in 1961 and my sister 2 years later, and my dad's response to being a Holocaust survivor was that he didn't like talking about the Holocaust. He didn't like telling people in Terre Haute that he was a Holocaust survivor. I can remember being a little child, and my mom would be very free with information, and my dad would say, if you talk to your friends, you don't need to tell them I'm a survivor. And so he wasn't ashamed, but I think that came from fear, because when he was growing up, to be Jewish was a really bad thing. And so I think he was, in his way, was trying to protect my sister and I, but I knew the difference between my mom's story and her response and my dad. But gradually, my dad, particularly as my mom opened up Candles Holocaust Museum in 1995, my dad started kind of, letting down his guard and became, from 1997 on, became very proud to be a Holocaust survivor. He would write letters to the editor. He wrote hundreds of letters to the editor, newspapers, magazines, and he would always sign it, Mickey Kor, Purdue class of 1952 Holocaust survivor. So initially somewhat, maybe not ashamed, but was trying to protect us. But years later, he saw that, there was so much good to letting others know that he was a survivor. He became very proud. My mom, obviously a little bit more outspoken, outgoing. When I was growing up, we didn't talk about the Holocaust every day. However, our parents, more my mom than my dad, would tell my sister and I very age-appropriate information. And the best example of that, I was 7, my sister's 5. Our next door neighbor was not Jewish, but they had a daughter my sister's age. So at times my sister would go play dolls or whatever. And so my sister's next door and they're having dinner, Mrs. Baker. And so we were used to, when my mom would do the dishes, we would see my mom's Auschwitz number on her left forearm. And so Rena, my sister, was there and watching Mrs. Baker do the dishes. And she says very innocently, Mrs. Baker, how come you don't have a number like my mommy does? I thought all mommies have numbers. Mrs. Baker, very sharp, and said, well, you need to go ask your mom. Oh, okay. The houses are very close together. So my sister came home real quick and said, Mommy, we're just finished dinner at Jill's, and I don't understand how come Mrs. Baker doesn't have a number like you. And I think most mothers, Holocaust survivors who are mothers, would probably say, well, you're too young. We'll tell you about that in the future. My mom didn't hesitate. And she said, well, Rena, remember your father and I told you and your brother the bad people did bad things to us. And one of those bad things was they put a number on my arm. Oh, and Mrs. Baker, she didn't have those bad things. Right. So my sister understood at the age of 5 that something bad had happened to our mom and dad, and that Mrs. Baker luckily didn't have those experiences. So, for me, that's how we were taught. I think one of the things that is important, that by the time I was your age, I knew all the stories. I got so bored with these stories because I didn't think it was a big deal. And I can remember age 13, 14, 15, with peer pressure and kids at school. And I would say, Mom, why can't you be like the other moms? And of course, now it's very embarrassing that I would even admit to that, let alone say that, but I did say that. And it was not easy growing up in Terre Haute to 2 Holocaust survivors in a community, very few Jews, 1 other Holocaust survivor. And so it's different than where you guys live. You have a huge Jewish community, one after another. So did I answer your question? I think I did.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, how you told us a little bit about how your dad got liberated and how he was very thankful and very happy that he wasn't in the Holocaust anymore. But what was your mom's reaction? And is there anything else that about your dad, about his liberation?
So, what was my mom's reaction to her being liberated and free? Is that
Yeah.
um well, I mean, first of all, my mom, from the time that my mom and my aunt, got to were taken from their home, lost their parents, every day she had in her mind what it would look like, how she was going to survive. She made up her mind that she was not going to end up on the filthy latrine floor where she saw the first day three children who had been killed. She made up her mind. So every day, she got there in May of 44 till January 45. One more day to survive. And so when they were liberated um, by the Red Army on January 27th, obviously there was extreme emotion. They were very hungry, and the Soviets brought food. And I don't know if you know the story, but a lot of the kids ate so much food they got very sick, and I think even a couple died. And so my mom and my aunt, if you see the pictures from the January 27th picture, which really were not taken January 27th, we can talk about that in a second. Um, their initial reaction was, you know, incredible elation and happiness. But then what would happen to them? Where were their parents? Where did they go? They're 10 years old and they have no idea in the world where to go, how to find their parents. Um, and so luckily they end up in this orphanage, and one circumstance happens and then the next thing happens, and Mrs. Changerick comes and gets them out. And so, my mom's short-lived and my aunt's short-lived jubilation of being liberated was almost immediately, within a couple weeks, um, reduced, decreased, because they realized that their parents were no longer alive. And so now, two 10-year-old girls, how are they going to get through life without their parents? And really, um, then when they ended up in Israel, their life started over. And one of the things, those nightmares that my mom had, those all stopped when she got to Israel. And I asked her why, and she said, "Well, the teacher was Jewish, the guy at the store was Jewish, the policemen were Jewish, everybody was Jewish, and she no longer had this fear." Either from the Nazis or the communists that she lived under from 45 to 50, that she could be killed. And so I think really it was probably the happiest time of my mom's life was once she got to Israel in 1950. Um, some of the other interesting anecdotal stories about my father, I mentioned that when he was liberated, he was given a Coca-Cola. When I was a little kid your age, I didn't know anything about Pepsi. We had Coca-Cola breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And my dad loved his Coca-Cola. I have a picture when I do a lecture of my dad in a Vienna restaurant with a Coca-Cola malt. And so even latter part of his life, he would always, the last day of his life, he had Coca-Cola in his room. And so, I think my father, because he was rescued by the U.S. Army, was very, very, very loyal to the United States. And both my parents really embraced being Americans, being home, being their new home is an area where everybody can be free. You have freedom of speech, freedom of religion. And so that was, for me growing up, it was very important to be involved in current events. And, my parents really embraced being involved in political activities, elections, and they would, my mom helped start the Head Start program, which was for African Americans in the late 60s. So there was this loyalty to the United States. My father, as you probably know, after he finished his pharmacy degree at Purdue, joined the U.S. Army as a pharmacist, and during the Korean War was a pharmacist in Osaka, Japan. So he was always very loyal. And I was also add years later, as he was getting older, he told my sister, look, when I die, I want a military funeral. And so when he did die, we arranged for somebody to play taps in my dad's memory and honor.
What would you say to be the most influential moment in both your parents' lives?
Wow, Coby, you're the one with the tough, really tough questions. The most influential. Can you ask me the question again so I can think about this? I'm stalling.
All right. What would you say to be the most influential moment in both your parents' lives?
Well, I think for my mother, there's no doubt that my mom is known for the forgiveness and probably, her ability to try to educate the world about the Holocaust. My aunt dies in 1993. My mom, through a strange series of circumstances, meets a Nazi doctor, and he agrees to document his role, the Holocaust at Auschwitz. And because of that, then my mom wanted to thank him. And then, as you guys know the story, my mom didn't know how to thank a Nazi doctor. And previous to the 50th anniversary in 1995, once she knew that Dr. Hans Mooch would do this, she came back to Terre Haute, looked for a thank you card for a Nazi doctor, looked for like champagne, nothing seemed appropriate. And after months and months and months of trying to figure out what was the best way to thank a Nazi doctor, she thought, well, me, the Mengele twin who was just trying to survive every day, the highest honor I could give another human being is to forgive them. And so that's where the idea of forgiveness came. It is often misunderstood, misconstrued. And my mom did this only in her name only. And so I think that's probably what my mom was most known for. And I think that's probably beyond taking so many people back to Auschwitz, and we're going back next week. But I think that's probably my mom's, what people know my mom for. My father, regarding forgiveness, he was really not known for forgiveness, and he would argue with my mom about this at the dinner table. But years later, after my mom died, he did also forgive. There was a Nazi guard, Bruno Day, D-E-Y, who was a Nazi guard at Stutthof, one of the camps my dad was at. And we have friends in Europe, and they knew about this trial, and they were wanting to find out if anybody that was at Stutthof would have some kind of response, an opinion, a statement about what they should do with Bruno Day. He was on trial, and I had no idea what my dad was going to say. This was January of 2020, right before the pandemic, about 6 months after my mom had passed away. So we told my dad the story, and he said, well, let me think about it. He was there at the same time as Bruno Day, but he didn't, obviously didn't remember him. And so after a couple of days of thinking, he said, okay. So we came back, and he read a statement, and his statement was that in your mom's memory, I will forgive Bruno Day. And so, not that he's known for that, but I think my dad is probably one of these survivors that you and others should research, because his story, my mom, and you can't compare pain. My mom was in camp. She was taken from her home in March, April 44, liberated January 45. My dad was in camp 4 years. And so, and some of these other survivors that you hear about and will hear about in the next week, they were in camp for years, and they still managed to have a normal life. And I think both my parents, the biggest influence for anybody, particularly young kids like yourself, teenagers, is that, no matter how difficult your life is, you don't make a basketball team, you don't get a good grade, a girl you like doesn't like you. I think what, all of you should think about, all right, is that, yeah, that's not fun to have a girl that doesn't like you that you like, or you don't make the basketball team or the baseball team. But life goes on, and you need to kind of pick yourself, off the mat and, try to make the team next year or meet another girl or do better on the test. That, life goes on and you can learn from these experiences and be a better person. And I think, my parents, both of them, I think should be known for really embracing life. And really, the other thing is they had this incredible sense of humor, both my parents. And I think really humor helped them get through the bad times.
Yeah, being funny is always a good thing. I like to be funny. I have a good sense of humor, like both of your parents. How do you think your parents managed to survive in the terrible conditions that the Nazis provided in the concentration camps?
That's a good question because when I think back, I was once asked at Auschwitz, um, what if you were here, kind of, you know, watching your mom, what would you see in 1944, 45? And my response was, I would say I'd probably see a little girl who was feisty that was refusing to die. And so, I mean, in the book Surviving the Angel of Death, which my mom wrote um, several years ago, one of the couple years after it came out, I thought, oh, I need to read the book again. I'm reading this book, and I kind of got lost. And I said, "Boy, this story is amazing. I wonder how this person survived." And then I'm thinking, "Whoa, that's my mom." And so, for me, and I think every second, third, and fourth generation, especially now, should, if they don't know their parents or grandparents or great grandparents' story, they need to learn their stories because that's why it's so important what you're doing, what your mom's doing, Jordan, because for me, it is amazing they survived. And it's even more amazing that they survived and lived a normal life and had two kids who are doing pretty well. And I think that's the amazing part is yes, they survived, but a lot of people, once they went through such a terrible event, they were never normal. They were never the same. I'd like to think my parents were pretty normal. And I'd like to think that they lived productive lives and they'll always be remembered. And as you just said, Jordan, sense of humor is important. And I think that played a big part.
You mentioned before about your mother forgiving the Nazis. How did you react to that, and how did you feel about that?
So, Coby, I was always kind of my mom's main critic, and I was her sounding board, especially after her sister, my aunt, died. So, when my mom told me this, that she was going to thank Dr. Munch by forgiving him, I said, "Mom, this is a terrible idea. You don't understand what you're saying. You don't understand what you're doing. The other Mengele twins, particularly in Israel, will not like this." Um, and she said, "I don't care. I don't care what you think. I'm doing the right thing. The world needs to know. And the best way for the world to know is to have a Nazi doctor describe what happened. And that's why this is so important." So initially, my knee-jerk response, Coby, was that I thought it was a terrible idea. Once that this event that took place January 27, 1995, I realized over the next several months that my mom's personality was starting to change. She smiled more, she laughed more, and she was never somebody who was always bitter, but it seemed like she was enjoying life more. And I think, as I say many times, that was 1995. She died, 2019, so that's 24 years later. I firmly believe uh, she would have probably died much earlier just because, being happy and being able to smile is so important in mental health and physical health. And I think that really freed her. But I was against the idea. And then on top of it, I would see people kind of come out of the woodwork to go. They wanted to learn about the Holocaust, but at times they also wanted to learn how to forgive a family member, and they would come to Candles Holocaust Museum or go on our trips with us to Auschwitz um, to learn about the Holocaust, but also to learn how to forgive somebody in their family or somebody else. So yes, I think it's she found this incredible strength and path to healing by forgiveness. If she would have listened to me, it would have never happened. So,
Now that's an incredible story, and it has such significance to your mom's life. And how old were you when you mentioned earlier that your sisters, like she started dropping tidbits of information when she was 5? How old were you and your sister when your parents like began to tell you about their stories and began to give you more information on what their Holocaust experiences were really like?
yeah, Jordan, that I around that time, 7, 8, 9 years old, we didn't learn about this like you do in school. Um, there was my textbooks were my parents, and so it was never something. When we would ask questions, we would ask, "How come we don't have grandparents?" So I can say, from when I was 5 or 6 years old, just thinking about your question, I said, well, how come we don't have parents? Mike and Eric have grandparents. They come, their grandparents come to their baseball games. How come we don't have grandparents? And they said, well, those bad people, killed your grandparents. And so I knew at a very basic level, 5, 6, 7 years old. By the time I was 12 and 13, I started learning more. And we would go, it seemed like every year, but it was probably every 2 or 3 years, we would go to Israel and see both sides of the family. And it wasn't like the camps were the only source of conversation, but definitely my aunt talked about the concentration camps. My uncle Leo, Shlomo and Leo talked about the camps. So little by little, I would pick up things. And really, one of the things around your age, maybe a little older, I was 17, 16, 17 years old. And probably the best example to answer your question is there was a mini series called Holocaust. It was on the NBC affiliate, NBC National. We went to the local NBC affiliate to watch the last night of the show. The last scene, the little boy's kicking a soccer ball. It's me, my sister, my mom, and my dad. And my mom was going to go on the local news after the last segment. And I look over, and my dad's crying hysterically after seeing the little boy kick the soccer ball. And I realized that my dad had so much pain because he saw himself in the little boy. And with my mom's emotions in check, she gave a great interview. And I learned then more about my parents' past, but also I learned that my dad was still suffering so much that I needed to kind of help him kind of come to terms with his past. Maybe he needed to talk more, and I needed my mom, or I wanted my mom to talk more about experiences because I think it helped her. So, yeah, I would say between the ages of 5, 6, 7, when I initially started hearing these things, and for sure by the time I was a junior or senior high school, I knew almost all the stories.
This kind of goes along with the previous question, but being the son of 2 Holocaust survivors, what were your childhood experiences like?
Well, that's a good question, Coby. A lot of times there weren't that many unique things that happened. Having said that, there are a couple things that your question I need to respond. When I was 12, 13 years old, all the kids are wearing certain nice shirts. We were very middle class. We were not poor, but we were not rich by any means. And so I can remember asking my mom and my dad, Mike and Eric, they have these shirts, hang 10. I want a hang 10 shirt. How come I don't have a hang 10 shirt? They have a hang 10 shirt, and I want to be popular like they are. My mom and my dad looked at themselves and looked at me. They said, Alex, when we were 12 years old, we were lucky to have one shirt. You have 6 shirts in your closet. Don't worry so much about having a hang 10 shirt. And it was a very tough lesson for me. It was very, very difficult because I wanted to be popular. And, to be popular meant you had clothes like everybody else. But also that meant, looking back now, it was very superficial, very, I was being very materialistic, which now as an adult, I realize that. And one other interesting example, I was on a United Hebrew Congregation basketball team. We were all, it was a church league basketball. We were the only Jewish team. And I think I was 12 years old, 11 years old. And one time we were on our way to a game, and one of the parents was driving. And we were talking about when we got to the age we could drive, what kind of car we would buy. I never thought about this. I mean, to me, I wasn't. I was realizing that we were not millionaires, and some of the Jewish kids in the neighborhood were much richer than us, and they could probably afford any car on the car lot. So there was some discussion, and somebody said, "Well, I know one thing. I'm not buying a German car because of what they did to the Jews during the World War II." And I said, I remember, I said, "Well, wait a second. Why wouldn't you buy a German car? If that was the best car, why wouldn't you buy a German car?" And they said, "Well, Alex, if anybody," they knew my parents were Holocaust survivors, "if anybody would not buy a German car, it should be you." And I said, "No." I said, "If there's one thing that I've learned from being, the child of Holocaust survivors, is I should not prejudge someone, some country, some car because of some history." I said, "That's one thing I've learned." And they all thought, "Well, that's crazy. You would buy a German car?" And I said, "If it's the best car and I get, it's worth the money, sure." And so I always remember that. And that was years and years and years before my mom went down the path of forgiveness. It's obviously probably the way I was raised. Um, so that's my answers.
Oh, those are two really great stories. And kind of a little similar to the last question again. How did being the child of two Holocaust survivors change your perspective of how you learned about the Holocaust and how you like listen to other people speak about the Holocaust?
How I learned about the Holocaust is asking my parents, more my mom than my dad, questions. Um, I didn't, as I said earlier, I don't recall ever having a high school or middle school class or course in the Holocaust. Um, and so, when you mention how other people spoke about the Holocaust, um, I think for me, that was always, particularly in Indiana, people would make brash comments about, I can remember, this is a little, I was already a podiatrist, but I can remember, and this isn't really the answer to your question, but this is what I thought of. Um, we were on our way to a baseball game. A bunch of us, I was in late 20s, early 30s, and we stopped at a convenience store on the way to the game. And a couple of the guys I didn't know well, and we got back in the car, and one of them said, "Well, how much did you pay for that donut?" And he goes, "Well, I jewed him down. I got it down to." I said, "What did you say?" He said, "I jewed him down." Oh, Alex, I'm sorry. You're Jewish. I didn't mean anything. I said, "No, no, no, no. You can't say that and not mean anything. Do you know what you just said?" And so I think people can be ignorant, and ignorance is ignorance. But I think whether it's something somewhat benign like this comment, when people will talk in very negative terms, anti-Semitism is something we all deal with, especially in the last year and a half, quite frankly, the last 10 years. But I just think that I probably I was more sensitive to, at least when I heard these things, I did not let them go. And another situation around the same time, my first year of practice, I had a patient that he had a bad foot, and I had to see him about once a week. And on the third appointment, he said, "Oh, I understand you're a Jew boy." And I said, and I don't like being called a Jew boy. And I said, "Well, I am Jewish." And he said, "Well," I said, "is that a problem? If it is, I can find you another doctor." He said, "No, no, no, no." And he kind of said, "Well, you're gonna probably take all my money." And I said, and then his wife says, "Oh, John, he didn't mean that, Dr. Kor." I said, "No, no, it's okay." I said, "You know what? I have to see you every week for at least another month because you have a bad foot. The next 3 visits, you don't have to pay a penny." He goes, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Well, I want to prove to you a point that us Jew boys, Jewish people, you're stereotyping and you need to learn a lesson." And so he said, "You can't do that." I said, "I can do anything I want." Uh, he didn't know it. I was on salary. It didn't matter. But I made sure the next three visits were no charge. And so, for me, it's not so much how I learned about the Holocaust, it's how people would say things in my presence, not necessarily knowing I'm Jewish and definitely not knowing my parents' history, and that I would not let that go. And not that I didn't want confrontation, but I wasn't just going to let it fly. I thought it was important that I let them know, not yelling, not being in any way belligerent, just saying, look, you shouldn't say that, or, calling into question. So I probably didn't answer your question directly, but that's I think that would be important for people to know.
I think that you gave us a better answer by
Okay.
doing that than you would have.
Okay, thanks,
But
Jordan.
what is it like when you go back to Auschwitz, where your mother was a prisoner of the Holocaust? What is it like when you go back there
Yeah,
every year?
yeah, great question. I mean, I went back. It's hard to believe I went back 40 years ago. This month was the first time I went back in 1985. I never had any thought that I'd be going back 40 years later. Um, the first time I went back, even the first two or three times, it was really weird because I knew where everything was, and my mom didn't tell me where everything was. It was just the questions I would ask, and I kind of, in my mind, had this idea of what I was going to see. And I can remember the first trip in 1985. People would ask me, "Oh yeah, her barracks are over there." And so, over the years, the trips have changed. My mom would have huge groups come, and you know, the emotion of the place and what happened to my mom and my aunt and my grandparents and great grandparents has never been lost upon me. And I still cry at certain places because I know my mom would cry. So and now since my mom did pass away during her last trip, July of 2019, it is really a very bittersweet trip for me because the memories of going there with my mom are obviously affecting me. But we're staying at the same hotel this time as when my mom passed away, and they never put me in that same area of the hotel. But I mean, it's always very bittersweet. But I also know that it's important. And one of the things that my mom and I never discussed, and probably the one regret I have, is I never sat down with her and said, when you're no longer here, what should be my role? I've never asked her that because I thought my mom was going to last forever, and she died very suddenly, as you know. And so that's probably the one regret I have that I never asked her. I do recall her saying, and this is kind of one of my motivations, that I want to go back when the camp is 100 years after 1945. So that means this year's 80th year. So I'll be going back for at least another 20 years just to honor my mom. So hopefully you two can go with me sometime. But the point is, no, it's not a fun trip. It's not like going to the Florida to the beach. But I think it's important. I go with Candles Holocaust Museum. We have about 40-45 people going this time. And I have a friend who's a podiatrist actually from not far from your area in Pennsylvania. And so, I think because I've been so many times, it is not easy. It's never easy, but it brings a lot of good memories, more good than bad, when I go back.
It's a nice way to honor your mother's memory, continuing the trip in honor of her legacy. Our next question is did you have any special holiday traditions growing up relating to the Holocaust or any traditions besides holidays?
We didn't have any traditions related to the Holocaust other than to go back to Auschwitz a lot. My dad, as you know, is not from Auschwitz. He was liberated outside of Buchenwald, and I've been there too. We had particularly, prior to when I was bar mitzvahed, it was a very important thing to have Shabbat dinner on Friday night. I can remember my mom praying and the menorah we use for Hanukkah. I still have, and it was an old menorah even 40, 50 years ago. And so, yeah, I think there wasn't anything in specifically that we had beyond going back to Auschwitz. Um, and so, but for me, when I think of traditional things, it's my mom with the menorah, the old menorah we had, which is actually still on exhibit at a museum here in downtown Indianapolis, which the exhibit closes next week. So I'll probably be getting that menorah back. But anyway, yeah, that's probably the best I can do on that one.
If your parents wanted to deliver kids like us and teenagers a message, what would their message be and why?
My mom's message would be number one, think of one thing that you can do every day to make the world a better place. And I think that applies to teenagers in New Jersey who are, Rutgers and Penn State fans. It can apply to anybody. Um, and my father would probably say, um, um, probably he would agree with my mom and his ability to always make a bad situation better um, was probably the one thing that um, was important for me to pass on. I mean, his love of sports, was something he passed on to me, and he, I think for my father, it was somewhat of an escape, but I think my dad. When and he lectured a lot from 1997 until 2020, um, he would impress upon students your age to study hard, to do well in school, to listen to their parents, um, but to try to make a difference in the world, whether it was on the athletic field or in the classroom or as a doctor, a lawyer, to try to be successful. I think that was very important for my father.
Thank you so much for your time, Alex, and thoroughly answering every one of me and Kobe's questions. We appreciate everything you have done to ensure the lessons of the Holocaust continue to be taught and that kids like us never forget them.
Jordan, Coby, thank you very much. Quite an honor.
The commemoration of International Holocaust Remembrance Day is a reminder of the consequences of anti-Semitism, prejudice, racism, and hatred. On International Holocaust Remembrance Day and throughout the year, we have the responsibility and the opportunity to educate and raise awareness about the dangers of intolerance and discrimination. Understanding the Holocaust, its causes, and its consequences is important not only for remembering the past, but also for creating a future where we respect and preserve the rights and dignity of all people.